Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode of New Album Spotlight, the show where I put the spotlight on a new album in progressive rock or related genre and explain it to you guys in my perspective and let you guys know if it's something you might be interested in to check out. Usually these are albums I'm really enjoying and digging lately and that I just want to spread the word about and let you guys know. And sometimes, like today, it's a big album within this genre of progressive rock that I feel like I have to cover because it's something that everyone's going to be talking about, and it's from a legendary prog act. And so I'm talking about Jethro Tull and their new album, RökFlöte. Or RökFlöte, however you want to say RökFlöte, I suppose. This is their new album. Of course, Jethro Tull on a prog channel like this one doesn't really need an introduction, but they've been around since 1967, a legendary band in the prog genre, really blending a lot of cool styles. Early on there was more of a blues rock style and vibe, but as they progressed they introduced some progressive rock elements and really cemented themselves with Aqualung and Thick as a Brick amongst the prog aficionados, and then it really introduced a lot of folky elements as well, and always had that ever-present flute sound baked into their music, and some really witty lyrics, and just some really fascinating, clever music that's developed throughout the years. Last year was a bit of a comeback album called The Zealot Gene. I believe it was after like a 13-year hiatus or something from the previous album, from their Jethro Tull Christmas album, but now it's a very short turnaround, and the next year we're now getting RökFlöte, which is a really cool new album from the band that showcases they're still alive and kicking and still doing what they do best. And so to me it's an album that's very much in the same lane as The Zealot Gene. If you like The Zealot Gene, you're probably going to like this. If you weren't that impressed with The Zealot Gene, you're probably going to feel similarly with this album, which is basically where I'm coming down on it. But it's a really interesting development. It started as a potentially instrumental album for RökFlöte, was basically the conceit at the beginning, which is why it's called RökFlöte. But as the music developed, Ian Anderson was really getting interested in some of these early culture and history of the Vikings and of their religion, this Norse mythology, pre-Christian belief system, and all of this kind of stuff. And so that became the inspiration for a lot of the lyrics here. So it really delves back into that Norse mythology and into the gods of that era and all these different storytelling elements of that fascinating time and period in history. So that's really the thematic elements that we get here on this album. And so the title comes between this translation of the word Ragnarok, or the rock part at least of Ragnarok, which translates as destiny, and then flute became flute of Flote with the umlauts, I believe, over the O, just to keep in line with the rock spelling, to give it kind of that interesting visual quality to it. And I think it really succeeds in making this album feel more old and mythical, and really delving into this mystical type of feel from that era, of this Viking era. That's encapsulated in the opening and closing tracks of Luspo, and final track is Ithavoll, which features some spoken word from Birna in Icelandic. It really adds to this mythical sort of vibe that they're really going for in the lyrical content, and just in the capturing that in the album itself. But to me, overall, you can't go into this album really expecting it to sound like his classic albums from the 70s. You know, if you go in expecting to hear the next Thick as a Brick, the next, you know, even Songs from the Wood or Heavy Horses or any of those types of albums, you're probably going to be disappointed, because this is a newer era for Jethro Tull, and they have dialed into a different sort of sound. You know, Ian Anderson in particular is older now, and his vocals are not what they used to be back in those days. You know, he has to do almost this kind of sing-speak kind of format, which isn't quite as inviting and as special as some of the singing that is done on some of those classic albums. So that takes away from the experience for me a little bit, but they're passable, they're serviceable, and I think he adapts his style of what he's able to do to make it fit within the mold of the music that he's portraying here. But really the star of the show to me is the flute playing itself. Ian Anderson is incredible on the flute, and it really works well here. All the pieces have fascinating flute work that just really bolsters up these pieces and makes them a little bit more special. And it almost makes me long for the album to have been an instrumental flute album. I think the instrumental side and some of the flute work, especially in a lot of the introductions to a lot of these tracks, is some of the best stuff that you hear on the album. And some of the singing passages, and when it gets more into that more typical song structure point, those can feel a little bit bland and not as memorable to me. And that's kind of the album for me, is it's really good to listen to. It's really pleasant and has a lot of pleasant melodies, and I enjoy my time listening to it. But I imagine it's not going to feel very memorable, and when I come down to the end of the year, this album probably isn't going to be one that sticks out to me. At least that's how the Zealot Gene was for me. So I recommend it for people who really like Jethro Tull and the flute sound and are really interested in what he's doing in today's modern music landscape. But it's really not an album that's going to revolutionize the way you think about music or Jethro Tull. You know, it's basically right in line with what he's doing. And some might call that kind of safe, that he's not really pushing any boundaries or doing anything wildly different or experimental. But I think that's okay. I think once you're older and you've really dialed into the sound that you're familiar with and that you want to play within, I think it's okay to just continue making music in that lane and in that style. But even within, you know, I don't want to disparage, but there's a lot of cool, interesting things within the different tracks, you know. I really like the second track, Ginu Gagap, and I'm sorry about my pronunciation. There's some weird words and spellings and things here, but Ginu Gagap. Really cool rock moments, some frenetic flute playing. We get Anderson's sing-speak kind of vocals. I think it rocks a fair amount, and it showcases that one of the improvements to me from the Zealot Gene is this is an album that has a bit more of a rock flavor to it, and it really gives the band a chance to shine in ways that the Zealot Gene felt a bit more like a solo album from Anderson. There was a lot of acoustic pieces that were basically just assembled by Anderson himself. And I think a lot of that was a product of the pandemic, that they weren't able to get together as a band and be able to play together in a way. So a lot of the album was constructed separately, and Ian Anderson just kind of created his own acoustic songs for that album. But this feels more like a band record. There's a lot of cool guitar moments. There's a lot of great keyboard bits in the background that brings a little bit of a prog edge to the proceedings. So I do like that they're moving more in a rockier direction than the Zealot Gene had. All Father really begins in a more lighthearted, folkier feel with that signature flute. Another breezy feel in the flute playing and a solid chorus. I really enjoy that one. Hammer on Hammer is one of my favorite tracks. It was released recently as a single. It has a kind of a darker tinged feel with that flute playing at the beginning. Has some cool guitar licks. Has a great guitar solo, in fact, towards the end, and it marches along with this somewhat darker atmosphere from a lot of the other tracks and really plays into that cool Norse mythology, darker Viking feel that I think the album's going for. Wolf Unchained starts and ends with some really interesting wolf howling, but then just proceeds into a pretty good driving rock number with solid flute leading. I really like the opening to Trickster and the Mistletoe. It like has this Irish jig sort of folky flavor. I feel like once it goes into the main melody and chorus of the song, it kind of dips a bit in its quality, but I really like the instrumental opening and ending, that Irish jig style that really adds a bit of variety and a little interesting flair to the album. The Navigators is a pretty cool single that was released also, a harder rock edge to that one as well, showcasing that in comparison to the Zealot Gene, they're really leaning into this harder rock direction. Not like really heavy rock, but, you know, it definitely has a more rock edge to it with some good guitar playing, some guitar riffing, in fact. I like Cornucopia as well for its lighter feel, keyboard and flute leading at the beginning, giving this pretty and pastoral sound. There's moments that it's almost delving into the classical style, even opening Guardian's Watch with that Baroque, almost classical feel in the flute playing. And that's where my favorite parts of the album lie, is in that really unique flute playing that delves into some rockier elements, but also some jazz stylings and some classical moments that really shows the diversity of the instrument and shows that Ian Anderson is really at the top of his form when it comes to his flute playing. And like I said, it would have been cool to get almost a full album of instrumental flute work, but I think what we have here is just a really interesting album. Like I said, it's really pleasant to listen to. There's a lot of great melodies, a lot of great lyrics, and Ian Anderson is a really good writer. And it's just really solid Jethro Tull music, not going to reinvent the wheel. It's not going to make people think this is the second coming of Thick as a Brick or Aqualung or something. But it's really solid for what it is. And considering Ian Anderson's age and how long the band's been around, I think it's a really solid effort from this late period of the band, and definitely worth a listen, especially if you're a fan of Jethro Tull and the folkier elements of their sound. I think this really harkens back a little bit to that folkier side that they were delving into with like Songs from the Wood, Heavy Horses, Stormwatch era of the group. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this review of Jethro Tull and that it gave you some impression of what the album's about, and if you want to go check it out. I'm betting a lot of you are probably, if you're Jethro Tull fans, you're already going to be checking this out, but it does come out this upcoming Friday on Inside Out Records, and it's really exciting to be a Jethro Tull fan and to see he's continuing to make music. Ian Anderson. And you could quibble, should this be called an Ian Anderson solo record, or should it be Jethro Tull proper? But I think it's fair for it to be Jethro Tull, and I think he's really leaning into the style of Jethro Tull and the sound that conveys rather than his solo material. And I think it's a solid record that should be enjoyed by many fans. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope you guys keep enjoying the music out there, whatever you are listening to. Thank you guys, and I'll see you hopefully in another video. Bye, everybody.
Was there a time when I was Jupiter?